He inherited a ranch in Texas and a strange warning from his grandfather: never open the old cabin. For decades, this place was kept locked for a reason. When he finally broke the rule, what was inside shocked everyone. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city or country you're watching from. The funeral ended without ceremony, without warmth, without anything that resembled closure. The sun hung high over the small Texas cemetery, bleaching the grass into a brittle yellow and pressing down on the mourners with an almost deliberate indifference. Elijah Johnson stood a few steps apart from the others, his black suit already heavy with sweat, his hands folded loosely in front of him as if he were waiting for instructions that never came. The people who had gathered were few. Some were neighbors he barely recognized, men with weathered faces and cautious eyes, women who murmured polite condolences without asking questions. Their presence felt obligatory rather than sincere, as though they had come to confirm that Silas Johnson was truly gone, and that whatever order he had maintained for decades might now be disturbed. Elijah watched the coffin lowered into the ground and felt a strange emptiness settle in his chest. He had not been close to his grandfather, not in any way that could be described as intimate. Silas Johnson had been a distant figure throughout Elijah's life, a man of few words and strict boundaries. Visits were rare and brief, phone calls shorter still. Questions about the past were always deflected, sometimes with silence, sometimes with a look that made Elijah regret asking. As a child, he had learned quickly that certain subjects shut doors that would not reopen. Now the man was gone, and the silence he left behind felt heavier than any conversation they had never had. After the service, the lawyer approached him with the efficiency of someone who preferred paperwork to grief. The documents were signed under the shade of a lone oak tree, its branches barely offering relief from the heat. Elijah skimmed the pages at first, his attention dulled by exhaustion, until a particular clause forced him to slow down. The ranch, all of it, was his. The land, the house, the outbuildings, the livestock rights. It was an inheritance far larger than he had expected, almost absurdly so, considering how little Silas had ever shared with him. And then there was the final condition, written with the same precise language as the rest, yet carrying a weight that felt entirely different. The old cabin was never to be opened. There was no explanation attached, no context, no justification. Just a clear, legally binding prohibition that stood out against the otherwise straightforward transfer of property. Elijah read it twice, then a third time, feeling a slow irritation rise beneath his confusion. It was like his grandfather to leave behind rules without reasons, even in death. The lawyer offered no clarification, only a brief comment that Silas had been adamant about that particular point. By the time Elijah drove away from the cemetery, the road stretching endlessly ahead of him, the thought of the cabin had already taken root in his mind. It was not curiosity at first, but something closer to defiance. The feeling that even now, Silas was controlling the narrative, setting boundaries Elijah was expected to respect without question. The ranch lay several hours away, far removed from the city life Elijah had built for himself. As the landscape changed, buildings thinning out, fields widening, the air itself seemed to grow heavier. Heat shimmered above the asphalt, and the radio lost its signal until only static remained. When he finally turned onto the dirt road leading to the property, he felt as though he were crossing into a different version of Texas, one that resisted modern intrusion and remembered things people preferred to forget. The ranch revealed itself slowly. First the fencing, long stretches of it, some newly repaired, others leaning with age. Then the main house, solid and unadorned, built for endurance rather than comfort. Beyond it lay the working heart of the land, the barn, the corrals, the water tower rising like a sentinel against the sky. Everything bore the mark of careful maintenance, not neglect. Silas had kept this place running until the end. Elijah parked near the house and stepped out, letting the heat envelop him. The land was vast, far larger than he had imagined, and the silence that surrounded it felt intentional, as though noise itself had been discouraged here. For a moment, he wondered why Silas had chosen to leave all of this to him, a grandson who had lived most of his life elsewhere, who had never shown much interest in ranching or land ownership. Inside the house, the air was stale but clean. The furniture was sparse, practical, arranged with purpose rather than comfort in mind. Nothing felt personal in the way Elijah expected. No family portraits on the walls, no clutter, no visible nostalgia. It was a house designed to function, not to remember. He moved through the rooms slowly, opening drawers, cabinets, closets. Everything was orderly. Too orderly. It was only when he reached the back of the house and looked out through a narrow window that he saw it. The cabin stood at a distance, partially hidden by overgrown brush and trees that had not been trimmed in decades. It was smaller than he had imagined, but something about its placement unsettled him. It did not belong to the working part of the ranch. It was not near the barn or the house. It sat apart, isolated, as though deliberately pushed to the margins of the land. A heavy chain wrapped around its door, the metal darkened by rust, the padlock thick and stubborn. A faded sign hung crookedly nearby, its lettering barely legible. Elijah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the heat. As he stood there, absorbing the sight, a memory surfaced uninvited. He had been a child, visiting the ranch once with his parents, and he remembered asking about a small building he had seen from a distance. Silas had stopped walking, turned slowly, and told him never to go near it. The tone of his voice had been calm, but the message unmistakable. That had been the end of the conversation. Now, decades later, the same warning echoed in Elijah's mind, reinforced by ink and legal language. The cabin was not just a structure, it was a boundary. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the land in deep oranges and reds, Elijah drove into the nearest town to buy supplies. The reactions he received were subtle but telling. When he mentioned the ranch, conversations grew shorter. When he mentioned his grandfather, people nodded with a mix of respect and discomfort. One man, an older mechanic, paused just long enough to say that Silas had been a man who minded his own business, and that it was wise to do the same. No one mentioned the cabin. No one needed to. On his way back, Elijah noticed a pickup truck parked near the edge of his property. It drove off as he approached, dust trailing behind it like a warning. He told himself it was nothing, that rural life bred caution and curiosity. Still, the image stayed with him. That night, lying in the unfamiliar bed, Elijah listened to the sounds of the ranch. The wind moved through the trees with a low, constant murmur. Somewhere in the distance, an animal called out, then fell silent. The house creaked softly, settling around him like an old thing stretching its bones. Sleep came slowly, and when it did, it was restless. He dreamed of doors that refused to open, of hands reaching out from the dark, of his grandfather standing just beyond reach, watching without expression. When morning came, the heat returned immediately, relentless and unyielding. Elijah rose early and began exploring the house more thoroughly, determined to understand the life Silas had lived here. In a small study off the main room, he found boxes stacked neatly against the wall. Inside them were papers, notebooks, old photographs. Nothing dramatic at first glance. Receipts, handwritten notes, maps folded and refolded until the creases were soft. Then he found a photograph that made him stop. It showed his grandfather standing beside a group of black men and women, their faces serious, wary, yet calm. The setting was unmistakably the ranch, but the image had been taken near the cabin, its outline visible in the background. There were no names written on the back, no date, just an image frozen in time, carrying questions Elijah did not yet know how to ask. He set the photograph down carefully, a sense of unease settling over him. The cabin was no longer just a forbidden place. It was a thread woven through his grandfather's life, deliberately hidden, deliberately protected. As Elijah stood there, the weight of the inheritance pressed down on him. Not the land, not the house, but the silence. The kind of silence that existed not because there was nothing to say, but because saying it had once been dangerous. By the end of that first day, Elijah understood one thing with unsettling clarity. Whatever his grandfather had sealed away, it was not out of shame. It was out of fear. And fear, he knew, did not survive on its own. It survived because there were reasons to keep it alive. The cabin stood where it was, waiting. And Elijah felt, for the first time since the funeral, that his inheritance had already begun to demand something of him. Mourning did not soften the ranch. It only revealed it more clearly, stripping away the illusions that dusk and night could offer. The heat arrived early, already pressing against the windows as if it had been waiting for Elijah to wake. Outside, the land lay in a wide, unforgiving stillness. Inside, the house carried the same restrained order he had noticed the day before, an order that now felt less like neatness and more like discipline. It was as if Silas had lived in a constant state of readiness, keeping everything exactly where it needed to be, allowing no loose ends that could be pulled. The photograph remained on Elijah's mind like a small weight that would not lift. He had placed it on the kitchen table the night before, intending to study it again in the morning, but he found himself avoiding it at first, as though looking too long might summon an answer he was not ready to receive. Instead, he moved through the house with slow purpose, opening drawers, checking cabinets, turning over the kinds of objects most people never questioned. He told himself he was simply taking inventory, learning what he owned now. Yet, he knew that was not the truth. He was searching for the shape of his grandfather's hidden life, for some clue that would make the cabin's prohibition feel less like a command and more like something he could understand. The study was the natural place to begin. It was a small room with a plain desk and a chair that had been worn smooth where Silas's hands must have rested. A bookshelf held manuals on ranch work, old dictionaries, a few history books with cracked spines. Against the far wall sat several cardboard boxes, sealed with tape that had yellowed with age. Elijah pulled one closer, tore through the tape, and lifted the flaps. Inside were folders, notebooks, and envelopes arranged with a carefulness that did not match the plainness of the house. The first folder was unremarkable. Tax records, receipts for feed, property maintenance expenses. The second contained correspondence with county offices and suppliers. Elijah flipped through these quickly, his attention snagging only when he noticed that Silas had kept copies of everything, down to the smallest transaction. The habit seemed excessive, almost paranoid, But it also suggested a man who believed paperwork could be the difference between safety and ruin. In a third folder, Elijah found handwritten ledgers. The writing was neat, compact, consistent. Names were listed alongside dates and numbers, but not the names of cattle buyers or equipment vendors. These were unfamiliar, many reduced to initials. The numbers beside them were sometimes small, sometimes larger, and rarely explained. In one ledger, Elijah noticed that the same initials appeared in clusters around particular months, and the pattern did not match any seasonal ranch rhythm he understood. He turned the pages back and forth, looking for headings, categories, anything that would clarify. There were none, only the steady repetition of coded life. He opened another box. This one held envelopes, many without return addresses, some postmarked from towns across Texas and neighboring states. A few had no stamps at all, as if they had been delivered by hand. Inside were letters written on plain paper, their language careful, restrained. They spoke of gratitude without details, of prayers and blessings, of relief found after hardship. No one named the hardship directly, but it hung behind the words like a shadow. Elijah read one line twice, then again, because it struck him as too specific to be coincidence, a reference to the little house that kept the night away. Another letter mentioned your shelter and the path you showed us. He set the letters down and stared at his grandfather's desk as if Silas might still be sitting there, silently watching Elijah turn pages he had never meant for anyone else to see. Elijah forced himself to keep moving. In the bottom of the box were notebooks, each labeled with a single year, spanning decades. He opened one from the early 1960s and found entries that did not resemble a diary so much as a log. Short lines described supplies purchased, routes driven, distances measured. Some entries noted weather conditions with unusual precision. Others recorded times, down to the minute, when something happened. Many pages were filled with nothing but initials and arrows, as if Silas had drawn a map in shorthand. Elijah could feel the purpose behind it, the sense that this was not written for memory but for function. A man keeping track of movements. A man who needed to remember exactly when and where he had been. He found a folded county map tucked inside the notebook, its edges worn soft. Several locations were circled, and a thin pencil line ran between them like a thread. Elijah recognized some of the roads, but others no longer existed, replaced by newer routes or erased entirely. The line ended near the edge of the ranch property, close to the cabin. The house, he realized, was only half the story. Silas had lived outwardly as a rancher, but his real life might have been written into routes that avoided towns, into supply lists that included more blankets than one man could use, into letters that thanked him without saying for what. The cabin's distance from the main house suddenly made a cold kind of sense. It was not an outbuilding for ranch work. It was a separate world. In the afternoon, Elijah returned to the photograph. He studied it more carefully this time, tracing faces with his eyes. The people standing beside his grandfather were dressed in worn clothing, not uniform, but practical. Some looked like they had traveled far. One woman held a child close to her side. Their expressions were not celebratory. They were guarded, as if the camera itself was a risk. Silas stood slightly apart, not posed with pride, but with a kind of grim steadiness, his posture suggesting he was bracing himself against something unseen. Elijah turned the photo over again, hoping for a date, a note, anything. The back was blank. He felt frustration rise, but beneath it was something else, something heavier. He had grown up in a world that told him history was something already settled, something preserved in textbooks and monuments. Yet, here, in his hands, was evidence of another kind of history, one that had been lived in fear and carried in silence. He knew enough about Texas, about the South, about the long reach of racism, to understand what those faces might represent. People who had been forced to move quietly, to survive without drawing attention. People whose safety depended on strangers who were willing to risk their own. As the day wore on, Elijah began to notice details around the house that had seemed meaningless before. A locked cabinet in the pantry that held not food but medical supplies. Bandages, antiseptics, old glass bottles that once contained painkillers. More than any rancher living alone would reasonably need. In a closet near the back door, he found folded blankets stacked neatly, some still tied with twine. On a high shelf were children's shoes, arranged by size, as if waiting. He held one small shoe in his hand and felt an unexpected tightening in his throat. Silas had kept this place prepared. It was one thing to suspect your grandfather had a secret life. It was another to see proof that children had once been here, that families had passed through this house or near it, carried by urgency and fear. Late that evening, Elijah drove into town again, not for supplies this time, but for information. The local library was small, and the air conditioning inside felt like a blessing. He asked for newspapers, old records, anything about the area's history. The librarian, a woman with tired eyes and careful politeness, seemed hesitant at first. She brought out a few local history books, then a reel of archived papers. Elijah thanked her and began searching, scanning headlines and names. He found references to his grandfather, scattered over the years, always mundane. Land purchases, cattle sales, a brief mention of a barn fire decades ago. Nothing about the cabin. Nothing about wrongdoing. Yet, as he dug deeper into older editions, he found stories that spoke of violence without naming it directly. Reports of men taken in for questioning who never returned. Mentions of labor disputes that ended in tragedy. Photographs of masked groups gathered in the night, their faces obscured, their purpose left to implication. The language of the papers was cautious, euphemistic, as if the truth could not be printed without danger. Elijah felt a familiar anger, not sharp but slow, the kind that came from recognizing a pattern that had shaped countless lives. He thought about his own family history, about stories told in fragments, about relatives who had moved north, then west, then back again, always chasing something safer. He thought about the way his grandfather had lived with closed doors and strict rules. Perhaps Silas had not been cold for no reason. Perhaps he had been carrying a vigilance that had become permanent. When Elijah left the library, the sun was already setting, and the streets were quieter. He noticed a man sitting in a truck across the road, watching him. The truck's engine was off, but the man's posture suggested he had been there a while. Elijah held the man's gaze for a moment, then looked away and kept walking. He did not want to give the stranger the satisfaction of seeing fear, but he felt the sensation anyway, a prickle along the back of his neck that grew stronger with every step. Driving back to the ranch, he caught the same truck behind him for several miles. It kept its distance, never closing in, never falling too far back. When Elijah turned onto the dirt road leading to his property, the truck slowed and continued straight. A coincidence, he told himself, but his hands remained tense on the steering wheel until the ranch gates were behind him. That night, he returned to the study and began sorting through the materials more systematically. He laid out the ledgers, the letters, the notebooks. He tried to piece together the puzzle as if it were a logical problem, something that could be solved by pattern recognition and persistence. And slowly, a picture emerged, not complete, but coherent enough to be frightening. Silas had been sending money to people whose names were hidden behind initials. He had been buying supplies far beyond his personal needs. He had been traveling routes that connected the ranch to points across the region, some of them remote, some of them near towns with the histories of racial violence. And he had been keeping logs that suggested coordination, timing, secrecy. Not the impulsive kindness of a man helping once. The steady work of someone who had turned aid into a system. Elijah realized that his grandfather's role might have been larger than he had dared imagine. Perhaps the cabin had been part of something like an underground network, not the romanticized version found in stories, but the real kind, made of fear, pragmatism, and risk. A network that existed because the law could not be trusted to protect everyone equally. He found a second photograph, older than the first, its edges worn. It showed the cabin more clearly, and in front of it stood Silas alongside another man, black, older, with a face marked by hardship. They were not smiling. Between them on the ground was a suitcase. Behind them, just visible, were tire tracks that led away into the brush, not toward the main road. Elijah stared at the tracks until his eyes blurred. That path, he thought. That was the route people took when they needed to vanish. In the bottom of the box, beneath the notebooks, he found a small metal object. A key tag, dull with age, engraved with a number. The key itself was missing, but the tag looked like something that would have belonged to a heavy padlock. Elijah held it between his fingers, feeling the weight of it. He could almost see Silas turning a key in his hand, deciding whether to lock something away or open it for someone desperate enough to knock. Beside the tag was a folded piece of paper. Elijah unfolded it carefully, expecting another receipt or note. The handwriting was his grandfather's, unmistakable, but the words were different from the rest of Silas's meticulous records. They were fewer, more personal, and they struck Elijah with an unexpected force. If you ever open it, do it for more than curiosity. Do it for the ones nobody protected. Elijah read the sentence again, then a third time, feeling his throat tighten. It was not an explanation, but it was an admission. Silas had known someone might open the cabin someday. He had planned for it. Yet he had still left a prohibition in his will, still tried to prevent it. The contradiction only deepened the mystery. Perhaps the will's warning had been for legal protection, a way to prove that Silas had not intended anyone to access whatever was inside. Or perhaps it had been his final attempt to keep Elijah safe. The note suggested something more complicated, that Silas wanted the truth preserved, but feared the cost of revealing it. The wind outside rose, rattling the window panes. Elijah stood in the study and listened, imagining the cabin out there in the dark, chained and silent, carrying whatever his grandfather had locked away. The house suddenly felt less like an inheritance and more like a staging ground, as if he had stepped into a story that had been paused and was now resuming, with him as the unwilling continuation. When he finally went to bed, he did not sleep. His mind kept returning to the same images, the child's shoe in the closet, the guarded faces in the photograph, the careful logs that tracked movements like a man preparing for pursuit. And beneath all of it, the steady sense that he was being watched, not only by the memory of his grandfather, but by something living, something patient. Near midnight, he heard a vehicle on the road beyond the property line. The sound was distant but distinct, the slow crunch of tires on gravel. Elijah rose and moved quietly to the window. In the darkness, he saw headlights briefly sweep across the far fence before turning away. The vehicle did not enter, did not approach the house. It simply passed, lingering long enough to be noticed. A reminder, he thought, a signal that whoever was out there knew he was here, knew he was looking. Elijah stepped back from the window and returned to the study where the photograph still lay on the table. He stared at his grandfather's face, at the hardness in Silas's jaw, at the way his eyes seemed to look past the camera as if watching for danger. Elijah had inherited the ranch, yes, but he was beginning to understand that he had inherited something else as well, something far heavier than land or buildings. He had inherited a silence that had been maintained by fear, and now, with his presence, that silence was starting to fracture. The cabin remained locked, but it no longer felt dormant. It felt like a heartbeat under the soil, steady, waiting for the moment Elijah would finally step close enough to hear it clearly. By dawn, he had made one decision, small enough to feel safe but significant enough to change everything. He would not touch the lock yet. Not until he understood more. Not until he gathered enough pieces to know what kind of storm opening that door might unleash. But he would keep searching. He would keep reading. He would map every route, decode every set of initials, follow every thread his grandfather had left behind. Because whatever Silas had done, whatever he had hidden, it had not been meaningless. It had been built carefully, purposefully, like a shelter constructed in secret for people who had nowhere else to go. And Elijah could no longer pretend that he had the right to ignore it. The next chapter of his inheritance was already pulling him forward, and he could feel, with growing certainty, that the cabin's chain was not just a barrier. It was a fuse. The decision Elijah made before dawn did not bring him peace. It only sharpened his awareness of everything around him. The ranch, which had felt vast and empty on his first day, now seemed occupied by invisible tensions, as if the land itself remembered things it did not want repeated. Every sound carried weight. Every distant engine, every movement along the fence line felt intentional. Silence was no longer neutral. It was charged. By mid-morning, the heat had already grown oppressive. Elijah worked outside, moving between the barn and the main house, not because there was urgent labor to be done, but because staying still felt dangerous. Activity gave him the illusion of normalcy. He checked fences, examined equipment, familiarized himself with the routines Silas must have followed daily. The work grounded him, but it also made one thing clear. This ranch had been maintained with a discipline that went beyond ordinary care. Everything had been kept functional, accessible, ready, as if Silas had lived with the expectation that at any moment he might need to act quickly. Near noon, a car appeared at the far edge of the property. It was not the dusty pickup Elijah had seen before, but a newer sedan, dark-colored, its surface reflecting the sun in sharp flashes. It slowed near the gate, but did not enter. Instead, it stopped, waited, and after several minutes drove forward at an unhurried pace. Elijah watched from a distance, his posture neutral, his expression unreadable. The car pulled up near the main drive, and a man stepped out. He was dressed casually, but expensively, the kind of casual that came from confidence rather than comfort. His boots were clean, his shirt crisp. He surveyed the ranch with a practiced eye, taking in the house, the land, the barn, and finally Elijah himself. The man introduced himself with polite efficiency, explaining that his family had owned the land in the area for generations, and that they made it a habit to welcome newcomers, especially those who had inherited property. His tone was friendly, almost warm, but something in it felt rehearsed. Elijah noticed how the man never quite turned his back on the cabin's direction, even though it was barely visible from where they stood. The conversation remained superficial at first. Condolences for Silas's passing, comments about the weather, observations about how much work it took to keep a place like this running. Then, gradually, the man's words began to carry weight beneath their surface. He spoke of stability, of tradition, of how certain arrangements had kept the county prosperous and peaceful for decades. He praised Silas as a man who understood the value of discretion, who had known when to focus on his own land and not get involved in matters beyond it. The implication was clear, even without being stated directly. Silas had survived because he knew when to stay quiet. When the man finally mentioned the possibility of selling the ranch, he did so lightly, as if it were merely an option worth considering. There were investors, he said, people with resources who appreciated land without complications. People who preferred clean histories, uncomplicated ownership. Elijah listened without responding, his mind already racing ahead to what this visit truly represented. This was not a neighbor checking in. This was a test. Elijah declined politely, stating that he had only just arrived and needed time to understand what he had inherited. The man smiled, nodded, and did not press the issue. But before leaving, he offered one final observation, delivered casually, almost kindly. Silas, he said, had lived a long life because he respected certain boundaries. It would be wise for Elijah to do the same. After the car drove away, Elijah remained where he was, staring at the empty stretch of road. The encounter left no bruises, no threats that could be reported or confronted. Yet, its message was unmistakable. Silence had a price, but so did breaking it. And the people who benefited from that silence were very much still alive. That afternoon, Elijah drove into town again, compelled by the need to understand just how deep the pressure ran. He visited the county records office under the pretense of confirming property lines and historical easements. The clerk assisting him was efficient but guarded. When Elijah mentioned his grandfather's name, the woman paused for just a fraction of a second before continuing, her voice unchanged. It was a small hesitation, but Elijah noticed it. He noticed everything now. He asked about old disputes, land conflicts, anything unusual tied to the ranch. The answers were vague, non-committal. Records had been lost, the clerk said. Fires, floods, misfiling, nothing out of the ordinary. Elijah thanked her and left, but the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. The absence of information was itself a form of evidence. Outside the building, he encountered an older man sitting on a bench in the shade, his posture relaxed, his eyes sharp. The man recognized Elijah immediately. He did not introduce himself. He simply commented that Silas Johnson had been a man who kept to himself, and that it was a good quality in a place like this. His words were not unkind, but they carried the weight of lived experience. Elijah sensed that this man knew more than he was saying, but also that he would never say it openly. Driving back to the ranch, Elijah reflected on how efficiently silence had been enforced here. It did not require constant threats or overt violence. It relied on reputation, on economic dependence, on the quiet understanding that certain questions disrupted more than they resolved. People learned early which stories were safe to tell and which ones were not. As evening approached, Elijah returned to the materials he had collected. He spread the notebooks and letters across the dining table, attempting to impose order on chaos. He began cross-referencing names, initials, and dates, building timelines that stretched across decades. Patterns emerged. Periods of increased activity corresponded with known spikes in racial violence elsewhere in the state. Supply purchases surged after certain incidents reported in distant newspapers. Silas had been responding to events, adjusting his actions to the rhythms of danger beyond the ranch. Elijah felt the growing weight of responsibility press against him. This was not a story about one man helping a handful of people. It was about sustained resistance carried out quietly, deliberately, in a place where being discovered could have meant death. The realization reframed the prohibition in the will. Silas had not been trying to bury the truth forever. He had been trying to delay its explosion. The sense of being watched intensified that night. Elijah noticed headlights pass the property more than once. At one point, he heard voices near the fence line, low and indistinct, followed by the sound of footsteps moving away. He did not investigate. He knew better. Observation was part of the pressure, a reminder that he was not alone in deciding the ranch's future. Unable to sleep, Elijah walked the perimeter of the house, staying within the faint glow of the porch light. From there, the cabin was barely visible, its outline swallowed by darkness. Yet, he could not stop thinking about it. He imagined Silas standing in the same spot years earlier, listening for the same sounds, weighing the same risks. The cabin had not only sheltered people fleeing violence, it had also sheltered Silas himself, giving him a purpose strong enough to withstand fear. By morning, Elijah understood something that shifted his perspective entirely. The prohibition in the will was not an attempt to control him from beyond the grave. It was a warning meant to buy time. Time to grow stronger. Time to learn. Time to decide whether he was willing to accept the cost of truth. That cost became clearer as the days passed. Small inconveniences multiplied. A delivery was delayed without explanation. A contractor canceled a scheduled visit. Calls went unanswered. None of it was dramatic enough to confront, but together it formed a tightening net. Elijah recognized the tactic from stories passed down through his own family. Pressure applied slowly, persistently, until resistance felt futile. It was during this period that Elijah met someone who would alter the course of his understanding. The encounter happened almost by accident, at a small roadside diner on the edge of town. He noticed an elderly man watching him with quiet attention. After a long moment, the man approached and asked if Elijah was Silas Johnson's grandson. His voice carried no threat, only curiosity tempered by caution. They sat together, not speaking much at first. Eventually, the man shared that he had been a young boy when his family passed through the ranch many years ago. He did not provide details, but his eyes held gratitude and something like grief. He spoke of a place where his family had been safe for a single night, a place they never spoke of again because safety depended on forgetting. He confirmed what Elijah had begun to suspect. Silas had helped many, and those who survived carried that debt quietly, afraid that acknowledging it might undo what had been achieved. The man warned Elijah gently. Some of the people who had benefited from the system Silas opposed were still powerful. They had children and grandchildren who had inherited not only wealth, but the expectation that the past would remain sealed. The cabin, he said, was not just a building. It was proof that could unravel lives. When Elijah returned to the ranch that evening, the sun setting in a blaze of red and gold, He felt the full weight of the decision forming inside him. Silence had protected his grandfather, but it had also allowed injustice to calcify into legacy. Breaking that silence would not simply expose old crimes. It would challenge the foundation upon which the present had been built. Standing on the porch, Elijah looked out across the land that now belonged to him. The fences, the fields, the distant trees hiding the cabin. Everything appeared unchanged, yet he knew that the balance had already shifted. The people watching him sensed it too. They felt the instability of a story no longer fully controlled. Elijah did not move toward the cabin that night. He did not touch the chain or test the lock. Instead, he returned to the house and continued his work, copying documents, securing backups, mapping routes. Preparation became his shield. Knowledge became his defense. The price of silence was no longer abstract. It was visible in every cautious glance, every unspoken warning, every attempt to steer him away from the truth. And as Elijah stood at the edge of that silence, he understood that whatever lay beyond it would demand more than curiosity or courage. It would demand commitment. By the time he finally lay down to sleep, the decision he had been circling for days had crystallized. He would open the cabin, but not yet. Not until he was ready to face not only what his grandfather had hidden, but the people who had spent their lives making sure it stayed hidden. The next step would be deliberate, and once taken, there would be no turning back. Elijah chose the night with care. He waited not for courage, because courage had already taken root inside him, but for quiet. The kind of quiet that was not empty, but thin. The kind that could tear if handled roughly. For several evenings in a row, he observed the rhythms around the ranch, noting when vehicles passed the road, when lights appeared and disappeared at the far edges of the property, when the land seemed most abandoned by watching eyes. What he learned unsettled him. The surveillance was not constant, but it was patterned. Whoever was paying attention did not need to see everything. They only needed to know when something changed. On the fourth night, the heat lingered long after sunset, clinging to the air like a living thing. The moon rose late and pale, offering just enough light to turn the land into a landscape of silver shadows. Elijah waited until the house had settled, until the sounds of insects had grown steady and unremarkable. He moved slowly, deliberately, carrying only what he needed. A flashlight wrapped in cloth to dim its beam. Tools chosen for silence rather than speed. The old key tag rested in his pocket, cold against his palm. The path to the cabin was not direct. Elijah avoided the open ground, following the tree line instead, letting the brush shield him from any distant view. Each step felt heavier than the last, not because of fear, but because of awareness. This was no longer an act of discovery. It was a crossing. With every yard he covered, he felt himself moving farther from the life he had known and deeper into something that had been waiting for him long before Silas died. The cabin emerged gradually from the darkness. Its shape was smaller than the house, but it carried a presence the house never had. The wood was weathered, the roof sagging slightly under the weight of years, yet it stood intact, stubborn, preserved by neglect and intention alike. The chain glinted faintly in the moonlight, wrapped tight around the door. The padlock was thick, its surface rough with rust but unbroken. It had not been meant to fail. Elijah paused a few steps away. For a moment, he did nothing. He stood there and listened, not just to the night, but to the echo of everything that had led him to this point. His grandfather's silence, the letters of gratitude without names, the faces in the photographs, the warnings delivered with smiles, the pressure that had tightened around him like a closing hand. He understood now that the cabin was not a secret out of shame. It was a barricade built against a world that had once been violently unjust and remained quietly dangerous. When he finally stepped forward, it was with a sense of resolve that felt almost calm. The chain resisted at first, groaning softly as Elijah worked the bolt cutters into place. He moved slowly, applying pressure in careful increments, mindful of sound. The metal gave way with a muted snap that seemed impossibly loud in the stillness. Elijah froze, listening for movement, for engines, for voices. There was nothing. The night absorbed the sound and kept it. The padlock was next. This took longer. The mechanism inside had fused over time, strengthened by rust rather than weakened. Elijah's hands ached as he worked, sweat tracing lines down his back despite the darkness. When the lock finally yielded, it did so reluctantly, releasing with a dull click that felt like a verdict. The door creaked as he pushed it open, the sound low and long, as though the cabin itself were exhaling after decades of holding its breath. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of old wood, dust, and something else beneath it. Something human. Not decay, but presence. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing a single room preserved in a way that made Elijah stop just inside the doorway. This was not abandonment. This was suspension. A wooden table stood near the center, its surface covered with neatly stacked papers weighted down by stones. Shelves lined one wall, holding jars, folded cloth, and tools arranged with care. Against another wall were several metal filing cabinets, their drawers closed, their surfaces dulled by time. On a hook near the door hung a coat, its fabric stiff with age, as though its owner might return at any moment. Elijah stepped inside and closed the door behind him, more to steady himself than to hide his presence. The beam of the flashlight moved slowly, revealing more details with each pass. Blankets folded tightly, an old kerosene lamp, a basin and pitcher, clean, unused for years but ready. On a narrow shelf, children's books sat beside medical supplies, their spines worn from handling. The cabin had not been a storage space. It had been a refuge. His breath caught when he reached the far wall. Photographs covered it from edge to edge, affixed with small nails, arranged not for display, but for remembrance. Faces stared back at him from different decades, black men and women of all ages, some alone, some in groups, some holding children. Their expressions varied: fear, exhaustion, relief, determination. In several photographs, Silas appeared at the edge of the frame, never centered, never prominent, as if refusing to make himself the subject. Elijah felt an unexpected burn behind his eyes as he realized the scale of what he was seeing. This was not a handful of people. This was a passage of lives. Beneath the photographs were handwritten notes, brief and factual, dates, locations, outcomes. Some notes ended with a simple mark indicating success. Others ended abruptly, unfinished. Elijah did not need to be told what that meant. He turned away, overwhelmed, and nearly stumbled over an object placed deliberately in the center of the room. A small tape recorder sat on the table, its surface carefully cleaned, a handwritten note resting on top. Elijah's hand trembled as he picked it up. The note was brief, written in the same steady hand he had seen in the ledgers. For Elijah. Listen first. The sound of the world outside seemed to fade as he pressed the play button. For a moment, there was only static. Then Silas's voice filled the cabin, younger, stronger than Elijah remembered, but unmistakable. Silas spoke slowly, deliberately, as though aware that every word mattered. He explained that if Elijah was hearing this, it meant the cabin had been opened and the choice had already been made. He did not apologize for the silence he had kept. Instead, he explained it. He spoke of the years when helping black families escape violence and exploitation was not heroic, but lethal. Of how men with badges and men with money had worked together to enforce a system that fed on fear. Of how the ranch had become a waypoint, a place to rest, to heal, to plan the next move toward safety. Silas admitted that he had not been able to save everyone. His voice tightened when he spoke of names Elijah recognized from the unfinished notes on the wall. He described the guilt that had followed him through every year of his life, the knowledge that doing some good did not erase the harm he could not prevent. He explained why he had sealed the cabin, not because he wanted the truth buried, but because he wanted it preserved until someone strong enough to carry it could emerge. As the recording continued, Elijah noticed something shift in the air. A faint sound from outside, footsteps brushing against dry grass. He lowered the volume instinctively, his pulse quickening. Silas's voice continued, describing how the most dangerous evidence was hidden behind a false section of the wall near the window. Financial records, correspondence, proof that the persecution of black families had been profitable, not accidental. Names of men whose descendants still held power. A beam of light swept briefly across the cabin window. Elijah's body went rigid. He killed the flashlight and moved quietly toward the wall Silas had mentioned, guided now by memory rather than sight. His fingers found the irregularity in the wood, the slight give of a board that had been placed, not nailed. He pressed carefully, and the panel slid inward with a muted scrape. Behind it was a hollow space, packed tightly with folders, metal boxes, and another recorder sealed in oilcloth. Elijah pulled out the nearest box and opened it just enough to see its contents. Photographs spilled out, more graphic than those on the wall. Images of chained laborers working fields under armed supervision. Copies of contracts and payments detailing transactions that reduced human lives to line items. Reports marked confidential, stamped and signed. The truth was no longer abstract. It was tangible, heavy, undeniable. The sound outside grew louder, voices now low and urgent. Elijah's time was running out. He gathered what he could carry, prioritizing the most damning evidence, the items Silas had clearly marked for discovery. As he worked, the cabin door shook violently. Someone tested the handle. Another voice cursed softly. The recording continued to play at low volume, Silas's voice steady even as the danger he described mirrored the danger Elijah now faced. Silas warned him that the people responsible would not hesitate to protect their legacy. That silence had been their greatest ally. That once broken, they would respond with force. The door burst inward. Light flooded the cabin as flashlights cut through the darkness. Armed men poured inside, their movements sharp, practiced. Elijah turned to face them, documents clutched in his hands, his heart pounding but his mind strangely clear. At the center of them stood a man Elijah recognized immediately from the earlier visit. The politeness was gone from his face now, replaced by something cold and hard. The man spoke, but Elijah barely heard him. His attention was fixed on the realization settling in his chest. The cabin had not just been opened, it had been activated. Everything Silas had prepared for decades had been waiting for this moment, waiting for the door to be forced, for the truth to be challenged openly. As the men advanced, weapons raised, Elijah felt the full weight of the inheritance descend upon him. This was the price of silence breaking. This was what Silas had lived with, what he had feared for his grandson. The documents in Elijah's hands were not just paper. They were a threat to a structure that had survived by convincing everyone it was untouchable. And now, with the cabin's door hanging broken and the truth pulled from the walls, that structure was beginning to crack. The men who flooded the cabin did not rush Elijah. They did not need to. Their confidence came from years of knowing how things ended in places like this. Flashlights cut across the walls, briefly illuminating the faces in the photographs before moving on, as if even looking too long at them was unnecessary. The documents in Elijah's hands felt heavier with every second, not because of their weight, but because of what they represented. Proof had a gravity of its own, and everyone in the room understood it. Elijah did not shout. He did not plead. He stood where he was, breathing steadily, letting the moment stretch. He had expected fear, even panic, but what he felt instead was a fierce clarity. Everything he had uncovered over the past days had led to this confrontation. The men before him were not random enforcers. They were custodians of a system that had survived by keeping its violence orderly and its crimes unspoken. The man who had visited the ranch earlier stepped forward, his boots crunching softly against the cabin floor. His eyes flicked to the open wall panel, to the exposed hollow where the evidence had been hidden for decades. Something close to irritation crossed his face, quickly masked. This was not how things were supposed to go. The past was meant to stay cooperative, even in death. Elijah understood then that the danger was not the weapons pointed at him, but the offer that would inevitably follow. Power rarely reached first for blood when it could reach for silence instead. The offer came exactly as he expected it would, delivered with calm precision. Elijah was told that mistakes had been made in the past, that history was complicated, that no one alive now bore direct responsibility for actions taken in a different era. He was told that these documents would only bring pain, legal chaos, and danger to himself. He was told that the ranch was valuable, that his life could be comfortable, that he could walk away from this burden and never look back. The words washed over him without landing. Elijah looked past the speaker to the photographs on the wall, to the faces that had trusted his grandfather with their lives. He thought of the children's shoes in the house, the letters written in careful gratitude, the routes marked in pencil on fading maps. He thought of how silence had protected men like the one standing before him, while others had paid with their freedom, their families, their futures. When Elijah refused, he did so without drama. The refusal was simple, unadorned. It was not brave in the way stories described bravery. It was inevitable. The atmosphere shifted immediately. The politeness evaporated. The men repositioned themselves, tightening the circle. Elijah felt the cold certainty of what they were capable of, but he also saw something else flicker across their faces. Doubt. Not about whether they could stop him, but about whether they should. These were not faceless monsters. They were men who had grown up hearing only half the story, men who had inherited obedience as easily as land or money. Some of them were realizing, perhaps for the first time, what obedience had cost. Elijah did not give them time to regroup. He moved deliberately, not toward the door, but toward the table where he had placed his phone earlier, hidden beneath the edge of a cloth. With a practiced motion, he activated it. The screen lit briefly before going dark again, the signal already sent. Copies of the documents, photographs, and recordings had been uploaded earlier, scheduled for release if a specific code was entered. Elijah had not relied on trust alone. He had relied on redundancy. The realization struck the man in charge almost instantly. His expression hardened, not with anger, but with calculation. He understood what had happened and what it meant. The truth was no longer contained within the walls of the cabin. It was already moving, already replicating itself beyond their reach. Outside, the night erupted with sound. Engines roared to life, tires spinning against dirt. Someone shouted orders. The carefully managed quiet shattered, replaced by urgency. Elijah remained where he was as the men hesitated, their authority suddenly less absolute than it had been moments before. Killing him now would not solve their problem. It would confirm it. The standoff ended not with violence, but with retreat. One by one, the men backed away, weapons lowered but not holstered. The leader paused at the doorway, his gaze lingering on Elijah with something like resentment, mixed with reluctant respect. This was not the end, his eyes seemed to say, but it was no longer the beginning either. When the last of them disappeared into the night, Elijah stood alone in the cabin, the silence returning in broken fragments. His legs trembled as the adrenaline drained from his body. He leaned against the wall, breathing deeply, forcing himself to stay present. The danger had not passed. It had only changed form. He did not linger. He gathered what evidence remained accessible, securing it in a bag he had prepared earlier. Before leaving, he took one last look at the cabin. The photographs on the wall seemed to watch him now, not with expectation, but with something closer to relief. The door had been opened. The truth had been taken out into the world. Whatever happened next, it would not return to the shadows easily. The following days blurred together in a relentless surge of activity. Elijah did not stay at the ranch. He left before dawn, taking back roads, changing routes, trusting no single pattern. He met with people he had contacted in advance, individuals and organizations equipped to handle what he carried, civil rights attorneys, investigative journalists, archivists who understood how to preserve evidence without exposing it to manipulation. Each meeting stripped away another layer of isolation. Elijah realized that while silence had once been enforced locally, truth gained strength as it spread. The response was immediate and fierce. Legal threats arrived first, delivered through official channels with impressive speed. Accusations of trespassing, of document theft, of defamation. Elijah's name appeared in local editorials framed as that of a reckless outsider attempting to rewrite history for personal gain. Anonymous voices online questioned his motives, his mental state, his integrity. The pattern was familiar, almost comforting in its predictability. This was how systems defended themselves when they could no longer rely on secrecy alone. More unsettling were the indirect pressures. Bank accounts flagged for review, insurance complications. Friends advised him to be careful, to consider his safety. Some of those friends stopped calling altogether. The cost of standing in the open became tangible very quickly. Yet, alongside the backlash came something Elijah had not fully anticipated. Messages from people whose lives bore the quiet scars of the past his grandfather had fought against. Descendants of families who had fled the region. Elderly men and women who remembered whispers of a ranch where people vanished in a good way, not the other kind. Their stories filled in gaps Elijah had not known existed. Each message reinforced the truth of what he had uncovered and expanded its scope beyond the boundaries of his own understanding. As investigations began to take shape, Elijah found himself drawn deeper into the machinery of accountability. He provided statements, clarified timelines, authenticated documents. Experts confirmed the material's age and legitimacy. Financial analysts traced the flow of money from obscure contracts and labor arrangements to fortunes that now appeared untouchable. The myth of isolated wrongdoing dissolved under the weight of evidence, replaced by a clear picture of systemic abuse sustained by profit and silence. The ranch itself became a focal point. Authorities requested access. Historians documented the site. The cabin was sealed again, this time not by fear, but by process. Elijah returned briefly under escort, walking through the space with a sense of distance that surprised him. The cabin no longer felt like a threat. It felt like a witness. Threats did not stop, but they changed. They became quieter, more cautious. Elijah sensed that those who had once relied on intimidation were now calculating outcomes, consulting lawyers, reassessing alliances. Power, when exposed, did not disappear. It adapted. Elijah understood this and refused to mistake momentum for victory. At night, when exhaustion finally overtook him, Elijah thought of his grandfather. He imagined Silas making similar calculations in a far more hostile time, without the protections of modern scrutiny or external support. The comparison humbled him. Elijah was not braver than Silas. He was simply living in a moment where courage had a different shape. The truth, once released, proved difficult to contain. Media coverage expanded beyond the region. Questions were asked publicly that had never been permitted before. Institutions issued statements heavy with regret and light on accountability. Yet, beneath the surface, real consequences began to form. Investigations widened. Subpoenas followed. Names once spoken with deference were spoken now with scrutiny. Elijah did not allow himself to believe it was over. He knew that dismantling a legacy built on exploitation would take time, patience, and resilience. But as he stood one evening at the edge of the ranch, watching the sun sink low over the land, he felt something shift inside him. The fear that had shadowed his steps since his arrival had not vanished, but it no longer ruled him. Silence had been a tool. Now, truth had become one as well. And Elijah understood that the battle ahead was no longer about revealing the past. It was about ensuring the future could not pretend it had never existed. The moment the investigation became official, the ranch ceased to belong solely to Elijah. It transformed into a place of convergence, where the weight of history pressed against the machinery of the present. Vehicles arrived in measured succession, not hurried, not dramatic, but deliberate. Federal agents, state investigators, archivists, and legal representatives moved through the land with a careful respect that contrasted sharply with the men who had stormed the cabin nights before. This time, authority did not arrive to intimidate. It arrived to record, to measure, to preserve. Elijah watched from a distance as evidence markers were placed around the cabin, as the false wall he had opened was examined and documented, as boxes he had once carried alone were now handled with gloves and catalog numbers. The process was slow and methodical, and for the first time since his grandfather's death, Elijah felt a strange sense of calm. The truth was no longer something he had to carry by himself. It had entered a system designed, at least in theory, to hold it. Experts confirmed what Elijah already knew in his bones. The documents were authentic. The photographs matched known locations and timelines. Financial records revealed patterns of payment that aligned with periods of forced labor disguised as legal arrangements. Names emerged, some familiar, some newly exposed, all connected by the same invisible thread. What had once been dismissed as rumor or coincidence now formed a structure too solid to ignore. News traveled faster than the investigations could. Local reaction came first, raw and divided. Some residents gathered in quiet anger, insisting that the past was being dragged into the present unfairly. Others spoke in hushed tones about things they had seen or heard, but never dared to repeat. The town seemed to split along an old fault line that had always been there, hidden beneath generations of politeness and avoidance. Elijah felt the tension whenever he ventured beyond the ranch, eyes following him in grocery stores, conversations halting when he entered a room. Then the story broke beyond the county. Statewide outlets picked it up, followed by national attention. The language changed as the scope widened. What had been framed locally as a family matter or a land dispute was now described in terms of systemic abuse, racial terror, and institutional complicity. The words were heavier, harder to deflect. Statements were issued by organizations and offices that had long benefited from silence, each carefully crafted to acknowledge pain without admitting liability. Apologies appeared without names attached. Elijah learned quickly that truth did not arrive alone. It brought chaos in its wake. Lawsuits were filed not only against families whose wealth could be traced to exploitation, but against municipal offices that had failed to act, against companies that had profited indirectly, against institutions that had looked away. Some cases stalled, others advanced with unexpected speed. The legal landscape shifted constantly, a living thing adjusting to the pressure placed upon it. Arrests followed, not in dramatic raids, but in quiet procedural moments that nonetheless sent shockwaves through the community. Men who had once been greeted with deference now appeared in courtrooms under harsh lights, their names stripped of honorifics. Assets were frozen, property seized, trust scrutinized. The unraveling was not total, but it was unmistakable. The foundations that had supported power for generations were cracking. Elijah found himself drawn into the process in ways he had not anticipated. He testified not as a hero or accuser, but as a witness. He spoke of what he had found, of how it had been preserved, of the care with which his grandfather had hidden and protected it. He was asked about Silas, about his motivations, about whether he had ever spoken openly of his actions. Elijah answered honestly, describing a man who had lived with vigilance rather than pride, who had chosen restraint as a means of survival. As the story of Silas Johnson emerged publicly, it unsettled many who had known him only as a quiet rancher. The narrative shifted from suspicion to something more complex. He was not portrayed as flawless or fearless. He was depicted as a man who had acted within severe constraints, who had made compromises and lived with their consequences. The nuance mattered to Elijah. It honored the reality of a life lived under threat, not the myth of a savior untouched by fear. The backlash did not disappear. It evolved. Elijah received messages accusing him of betrayal, of exaggeration, of exploiting history for personal gain. Some came anonymously. Others bore real names, people whose families were now under scrutiny. Elijah read none of them closely. He understood that anger was a predictable response when comfort was disturbed. What surprised him were the messages that came quietly, often late at night, from people who simply said thank you. People who had lost relatives without explanation. People who had been told their entire lives that their pain was exaggerated, that their memories were unreliable. The ranch itself became a site of reckoning. Historians documented it thoroughly, mapping routes, preserving structures, collecting oral histories from those willing to speak. The cabin, once a place of refuge and secrecy, was now treated as a crime scene and a historical artifact simultaneously. Elijah stood inside it one final time before it was sealed for preservation. The photographs still lining the walls, the silence now heavy with acknowledgement rather than fear. He felt a complicated grief settle over him. Not just for his grandfather, but for the years Silas had spent carrying this burden alone. Elijah understood now why Silas had been distant, why warmth had been rationed. Love, in that context, had been dangerous. Attachment had been a liability. Silence had been armor. As the months passed, the intensity of the investigations ebbed and flowed, but their direction remained steady. Some figures avoided conviction through legal maneuvering. Others faced sentences that reflected, if not the full measure of their crimes, at least a public accounting. The community adjusted, reluctantly, to a new reality where certain names no longer commanded unquestioned respect. Elijah's own life changed in ways both subtle and profound. He was no longer anonymous. His presence carried meaning whether he wanted it to or not. Invitations arrived alongside warnings. Support arrived alongside isolation. He learned to navigate this new existence with the same deliberation his grandfather had once employed, though under very different circumstances. One evening, as Elijah walked the perimeter of the ranch at dusk, he felt the land differently. It no longer seemed to press inward, no longer watched him with quiet hostility. The air felt lighter, though the heat remained. The silence, too, had changed. It was no longer a tool used to erase. It had become a pause, a space where voices could finally emerge. Elijah stopped near the cabin, now secured behind barriers and notices marking it as protected. He placed his hand against the weathered wood and closed his eyes. For a moment, he imagined all the people who had passed through this place, carrying fear, hope, exhaustion. He imagined his grandfather watching them leave, knowing that survival often meant never being seen again. The fall of silence did not restore what had been taken. It did not undo suffering or resurrect the dead, but it did something quieter and perhaps more enduring. It disrupted the lie that nothing had happened. It replaced absence with record, denial with documentation. As Elijah stood there, he understood that the story was no longer about exposure alone. It was about what followed, about how truth was held, taught, and transformed into action. The past had been forced into the open. The future now demanded a response. He turned back toward the house as the last light faded from the sky, already sensing that the final chapter of his inheritance had yet to be written. Time did not close the wounds the truth had opened, but it reshaped how they were carried. Months passed, measured not by seasons alone, but by court dates, archival releases, and the slow rhythm of institutions learning to move in directions they had long resisted. The ranch settled into a new role, no longer a private inheritance defined by silence, but a place where memory gathered and refused to disperse. Elijah remained there through it all, not out of stubbornness or defiance, but because leaving would have felt like repeating an old pattern. This land had been used to hide people from hatred. Now it would be used to confront it. The investigations continued, uneven and imperfect. Some cases advanced decisively, others stalled in the thicket of appeals and procedural delays. Elijah learned to accept that justice, when it arrived at all, arrived in fragments. Still, fragments mattered. Names once spoken only in whispers were now etched into public records. Transactions that had passed unnoticed for decades were mapped and traced, revealing networks of profit built on coercion and erasure. For many families, it was not the verdicts that mattered most, but the acknowledgement. To have a loss named was to recover a piece of dignity long denied. Elijah's life reorganized itself around the work that followed revelation. He spent long hours with archivists and historians, ensuring that documents were preserved without distortion. He met with descendants of those who had passed through the ranch, listening more than he spoke, understanding that the story was no longer his to narrate alone. Each meeting added texture to what had once seemed abstract. Lives unfolded before him in all their complexity, shaped by fear and resilience in equal measure. The idea of a foundation emerged not as a grand plan, but as a necessity. It began with a question Elijah could not escape. What did it mean to inherit a legacy that had been built on protection rather than possession? Silas had not hoarded land or wealth to assert dominance. He had used what he had to create space where others could breathe. To honor that, Elijah realized, required more than remembrance. It required continuity. The foundation took shape slowly, with care taken at every step. Elijah resisted the urge to act hastily, mindful of how easily good intentions could be undermined by poor structure. He assembled a small board made up of legal advocates, educators, historians, and representatives from families directly affected by the past. Decisions were debated thoroughly. Transparency was non-negotiable. The goal was not to replace one gatekeeper with another, but to build something that could not be quietly redirected or absorbed by convenience. Its mission reflected the lessons Elijah had learned on the ranch. Legal assistance formed its backbone, providing resources to individuals and families navigating the aftershocks of systemic discrimination. Education followed, not as a vague promise, but as concrete opportunity, scholarships tied to mentorship, programs that connected historical truth to present realities. Medical and psychological support addressed wounds that records alone could not heal. Trauma had a way of passing itself down, and confronting it required more than documentation. A center of memory became the foundation's heart. The cabin, preserved with care, stood not as a monument to fear but as a testament to shelter. Portions of it were made accessible under guided conditions, the photographs contextualized, the records explained without spectacle. The aim was not to shock, but to teach, to show how ordinary places could become extraordinary when someone chose to act. The ranch itself changed in subtle ways. Paths were cleared, not to erase the past, but to invite people into it safely. Gathering spaces emerged near the main house, simple structures designed for conversation and learning rather than ceremony. Each addition was made with restraint, guided by the understanding that the land had already held enough weight. It did not need embellishment. Elijah remained deeply involved, but he was careful not to position himself at the center. He had learned from Silas's example that leadership rooted in humility endured longer than leadership driven by recognition. When asked to speak publicly, he did so sparingly, always redirecting attention to the people whose lives the story truly belonged to. The foundation's work gained credibility not through publicity, but through consistency. There were difficult moments. Funding ebbed and flowed, sometimes threatened by political shifts or public fatigue. Critics questioned motives, accused the foundation of reopening wounds better left alone. Elijah listened to these criticisms without dismissing them outright. He knew that memory could be painful, but he also knew that untreated pain did not disappear. It calcified. On evenings when exhaustion settled deep into his bones, Elijah walked the land as he had during those first uncertain days. The ranch no longer felt like a place under siege. The silence that once pressed inward now stretched outward, making room for voices, for footsteps, for the ordinary noise of people existing without fear of discovery. He found comfort in those sounds, in the knowledge that the land was finally being used in the open. One evening, as the sky burned low with color, Elijah stood near the cabin and thought of his grandfather with a clarity he had not known before. Silas had lived his life constrained by the need to protect others and himself from a world that punished deviation. His distance, his reserve, his rules all took on new meaning. Elijah did not absolve him of every choice. He no longer felt the need to. Understanding did not require erasure of complexity. It required honesty. Elijah recognized that Silas's final prohibition had not been a command meant to last forever. It had been a pause, a deliberate delay, until circumstances changed and someone could step forward with less risk and more support. The inheritance, then, had never been the land alone. It had been the responsibility to decide when the pause ended. As the foundation's work expanded, Elijah saw its impact ripple outward in ways he had not anticipated. Young people visited the ranch and asked questions that once would have gone unanswered. Families reclaimed names that had been lost to fear. Scholars incorporated newly available records into curricula that reshaped understanding beyond the region. The past did not loosen its grip easily, but it did begin to loosen. There were moments of quiet triumph that never reached headlines. A scholarship awarded to a student who would have otherwise gone without. A legal case resolved because documentation now existed where there had once been denial. A memorial service held not in secrecy, but in daylight, attended by people who no longer felt compelled to lower their voices. Elijah learned to accept that the work would never truly be finished. Justice was not a destination but a practice, one that demanded attention even when urgency faded. He did not romanticize this reality. He simply committed to it. On the anniversary of Silas's death, Elijah placed flowers near the cabin, not as a gesture of grief, but of acknowledgement. He stood there for a long time, listening to the wind move through the trees, feeling the presence of all that had passed through this place. The fear that had once defined it no longer held power. In its place stood memory, structured and shared. As night fell, Elijah returned to the house and turned off the lights one by one. The ranch rested in darkness, not the kind that concealed, but the kind that allowed rest. He knew there would be more challenges ahead, more resistance, more attempts to soften or redirect the truth. But he also knew that something fundamental had changed. The story could no longer be closed. Silas had acted when action required invisibility. Elijah acted when action required openness. Together, across time, they had shaped a legacy defined not by ownership, but by care. The land endured, not as a witness to silence, but as a testament to the choice to break it and build something better in its place. If this story held your attention until the end, make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story. New videos are released regularly, and the next one may be even darker, deeper, and more surprising than this. Watch another video on the screen right now to continue the journey into hidden histories, buried secrets, and lives changed forever. And if this story mattered to you, share it with someone who needs to see it. The more people who watch, the harder it becomes for stories like these to be forgotten.